Welcome back, everybody. As some of you will know, I'm Sophie Duncan. I co-direct the NCCPE with Paul Manners, and we're going to be hosting this session today. I really hope you've been having a stimulating time at the conference and have made lots of new connections. And the Actions Padlet is beginning to be populated with some of the actions that are coming out of our plenary sessions, some of the actions that have come out of the PEP Insight research, and some of the actions that have come up from the workshops. And just a reminder for workshop leaders, do pop your actions into the Actions Padlet, and we're going to be doing a group exercise around that in our closing plenary. Just a note, as you all will know, we're recording the session, and this recording will be made available for people who aren't able to attend and participate in the plenary with us today. Our third plenary is all about creating living knowledge, and the title was inspired by the Creating Living Knowledge report that was written a few years ago now by Kerry Facer and Brian Enright, and some of you will know it and will have used it in your work, and I'm hoping one of my colleagues will pop a link to that in the chat. And the report was all about reflecting on communities and universities working together to create knowledge that leads to change. And there were lots of helpful insights into the nature of community-university partnership and the importance specifically of time when you're trying to think about relationship building. And that report was reporting on the Connected Communities Programme, which was an AHRC and ESRC funded programme that was encouraging collaborative research between communities and universities. And I think when we think about creating living knowledge, we have to really think about the different aspects of what that means. What does it mean for funders who are trying to fund these kinds of ways of working? What does it mean for those setting policies around it? What does it mean for sector, for the universities, and for research teams? What does it mean for public engagement professionals and for the communities that they're working with? So we have 4 speakers today, and 3 of them are here live with us, and we're going to be talking with them and having a panel discussion with them. But to kick us off is our first speaker, who sadly isn't with us today because she's taking strike action. And our first speaker is Kate Pahl, who's Professor of Art and Literacy at Manchester Metropolitan University. And Kate has worked on collaborative research for many, many years. Indeed, she was one of the people who we were involved with when we first set up the UK Community Partner Network, well, about 8 years ago now. And she has a huge amount of experience of participating with others to create living knowledge. And so one of the projects that she's currently leading is a project called Treescapes, which is funded by UKRI. And the Treescapes programme is trying to develop new methods of engaging young people in designing and creating and caring for treescapes, including natural woodlands and urban parks. And here's her recorded presentation all about what creating living knowledge means for her.
My name's Kate Pahl. I'm Professor of Arts and Literacy at Manchester Metropolitan University. I've spent many years combining an understanding of community development work, which I brought with me into academia, with a real interest in how communities make meaning. How do you value the living knowledge within communities? But what methods are there to do that work? What we're actually understanding is that this is relational knowledge creation. It's skilled, and it's understanding and embracing the actual human relationships at the centre of collaborative research. Within the everyday, there are so many pockets of knowledge, and I think one of the things academics have to do is start to reimagine working with that knowledge and what that could be. I think what the conditions for this to thrive, this kind of living knowledge approach, is that we really need to think about how to create trust and respect within collaborative teams. So when I started my Treescapes project, we had a retreat in Cumbria, which is indeed a beautiful place. We had a face-to-face retreat, which was even more amazing. And we wrote our own code of practice in order to foster trust. And it's quite a lot of things, including being respectful of what people share with us, creating a safe space, encouraging everyone to ask about what they don't know, encouraging people to acknowledge and share their expertise, being mindful of people's different circumstances and positionalities, and respecting people's perspectives, investments, needs and expectations, as well as acknowledge and seeking to address power hierarchies, including career stages. And we will practice affirmative ethics. We will have fun and play. We will practice unconditional positive regard for ourselves. We will take breaks, and we will make spaces for different ways of communicating and participating. Those were developed by our group, but I would like to acknowledge my colleague, Caitlin Nunn, who facilitated that. I think immediately of place, which is human geography. Place is a source of living knowledge. I think of time, intergenerational knowledge. We're working right back with sediment cores from early settlements into grandparents. I think living knowledge is carried across generations. It's carried within place. It's carried within language and culture. So I think a lot about multilingualism and young people speaking different languages, and that living knowledge is in the languages, in the nuances of Pahari. I've just had a great conversation with a group of colleagues about an area in Pakistan, and that living knowledge is carried within those families. I also think living knowledge can be made. And I think that's a new idea, which is that I've been in quite a lot of creative events with, for instance, outdoor film projections against the side of a school, where the living knowledge is actually in the interchange of the ideas, the excitement of seeing a film, or actually just a discussion. And actually dialogue is living knowledge, and dialogue and listening is living knowledge. I do love zines. I'm just finished a conversation about zines, and zines are great because they're small bits of knowledge that you can create and share. I also think mechanisms for sharing knowledge are really important, mechanisms for exchange, for listening, for reciprocity. So my idea of living knowledge is both as a form, and it's spatial, and it has time, and it's actually entangled. It's like an ivy around a tree, and you can bring those things together and make something so exciting that you don't know. I'm so excited about finally combining actual science of carbon sequestration with the knowledge and informed intergenerational understanding of the communities in Old Trafford and Rotherham, where we're doing our project. And I'm also really excited about interdisciplinary work, which takes on living knowledge as an actual living thing and entwines it together with the trees and the different knowledges of tree planting and carbon sequestration to reimagine future treescapes. I think that you can all take hold of this idea in different ways, but what I hope this talk has done is give you a flavour of that kind of vibrancy of that kind of work. It's both in and out of the university, but it's beyond both university and community. It's built together.
Thank you. And thank you, Kate. That was rather beautiful and vivid and I think eloquent description of what living knowledge means to Kate. We're now going to invite you, if you have questions for Kate, please do use the chat, and Kate will pick those questions up next week and answer them. And also she's shared with us some slides with just some references that explain some of the work she described there. But let's now start with our panel. And I'm delighted to welcome Rusi Jaspal from the University of Brighton, someone who really values engagement in his own practice as a researcher, and now excitingly is PVC Research and Knowledge Exchange at the University of Brighton. And I think is really committed in that senior role to build on that fantastic practice of community engaged practice that the university is so well known for. So Rusi, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Paul. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a very important focus for me, the knowledge exchange part and also the community engagement part. I think for me, one of the challenges I've encountered over the years has been, as Professor Pahl said, establishing trust within communities, because that is such an important first step towards being able to work in a co-creation sort of manner in order to create participatory research that's really meaningful for communities. So one of the things that we've really tried to do, and something I've encouraged certainly researchers within my team to do, is to elucidate the value of research for those communities, to talk to them about how they may benefit and to enable them to understand the research. Because I think a common reaction to not understanding something is to disengage from it. And actually the engagement really is dependent on people having an understanding and being able to position that research in relation to their own identities, the things that they may be facing, and so on. I think the trust issue is a really key one, partly because some people may fear, they may be worried about how research could be misused or how what they say could be misinterpreted. And I think that's a really key challenge as well. And of course, one of the really significant solutions to the sorts of issues I've outlined is by equipping people from within particular communities with the skills to carry out research in a collaborative manner, because we know the best research is always collaborative, and to empower them to be able to do research. And that is a really great way of establishing trust. So I'd just like to briefly point to a few projects that sadly I was not involved in because they precede my appointment as PVC Research Knowledge Exchange, but which I am delighted to talk about because I just think they're absolutely brilliant examples of community engagement and research within communities. So our Ignite program, which was funded by UKRI, supported a series of projects. One of them, for instance, working with one of the only community pubs in the United Kingdom in an area like ours, the Bevy. It established a living lab to understand the perennial issue of loneliness, particularly within marginalized communities that are facing socio-economic inequalities. And together, the researchers from within the community, but also from the University of Brighton, were able to co-create potential solutions that were acceptable to the people of Moulscombe, where the Bevy is located. And that then provided a template, I believe, that could potentially be replicated in other communities and which could be really trialed and tested within other communities. Another project working with a local community partner was to make arts and culture more accessible to local people. And the research component was around understanding the potential barriers, looking at potential ways of engaging people within this sector, but also looking at ways in which people might influence what the sort of conceptualization of art and culture actually is, because there can be a real sense of orthodoxy around that. And I think, again, that's a very good example of co-creation. And just finally, a project looking at community solutions to the housing crisis in Brighton and Hove, and enabling people who are really at the centre of that to have greater political participation to influence policymaking. And we saw that as really important. So just a few really great projects that I'm very proud of that have been carried out in my institution that all show how trust is absolutely vital for achieving this, and how that's got to be a first step, in my view, to really achieving the living lab. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rusi. And we're going to be sharing a conversation with Rusi and the other panelists shortly, and we can be exploring in more depth some of those things that they're raising. But it's my pleasure to introduce Helen Goulden. She's the Chief Executive of the Young Foundation and has a huge amount of experience and expertise in creating and developing living knowledge. So Helen, it's a delight to welcome you to the stage. This floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And that was great, Rusi. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So the Young Foundation, just to pitch us really in a way, is that our vantage point is somewhat outside academia. We're an IRO, but we're continually operating at the boundary where innovation, community and research meet. So I come at it from my slightly perhaps different perspective, because everywhere we look, across all the sectors that we work, everybody in every sector is really grappling with new ways of organising in order to tackle very complex problems. So it's an independent research organisation, Tony. So essentially requiring people, in order to tackle complex problems, having to work in communities more, but also having to transcend traditional boundaries and remits. So communities are looking for having more influence and power and agency on the issues that influence their well-being. Local councils and health services desperately want to work differently with their communities. Educators are seeking to have a different kind of education for young people in schools and have a system influence outside their school gates. Businesses know that they need to, and often are trying to, become a more positive force for change, transcending their sort of traditional remits. And governments, particularly local governments, are really increasingly aware of the loss of trust in our democracy and democratic engagement, which is why you see so much innovation in participation around citizens' assemblies and participatory budgeting and so on. So the fact that universities are increasingly exploring how to work differently with communities and with new kinds of knowledge in ways that transform and transcend formal boundaries and explore ways of working in much more complex, messy, interactive and social environments is not just your gig, right? It's something that is happening across every sector, and it's a much, much larger cultural shift in our society. And so the point of saying that is that I don't really think that a conversation today about living knowledge as an academic community endeavour, for me, it's much more helpful to think about it as a way of working to support all those other institutional actors to traverse some really quite complicated and systemic challenges, whether they're working in prisons or healthcare or schools or councils or whether. So it's more of a trialogue between a sector, a community and an academic research team, as much as it is a sort of dialogue between those two. Our approach, we've got lots of examples, but I think our approach takes in general sort of three forms when operating at three levels, all that sort of hopefully resonate with each other. First is the self. So the people who participate in our community research absolutely have to feel that it's valuable for them. And evidentially in our work, we can plot ways in which people have gained skills, knowledge, competencies and confidence to go on to do other work, jobs, different kinds of activities that they absolutely, almost certainly would have not done had research not been their entry point for engagement. The second takes us from self to community. So really thinking about how the work we do actually prompts civic and social action and innovation. So I might be slightly controversial, I don't know, but I believe that this kind of work only is really useful if that living knowledge is a precursor to mobilizing and catalyzing some form of change. And the production of artifacts and reports and pictures and so on, I think it's fantastic, but that's not the work. The work is the impact that follows. And third level is the system. So really, how do we think about building thicker, more qualitatively different relationships across systems leaders and institutions with communities that have some sustained sense of purpose and value creation. Thanks, Sophie.
Great. Thank you very much, Helen. And our final speaker is Stephen Hill, who many of you will know from his role as Director of Research at Research England, and his responsible role includes a really instrumental role in shaping the Research Excellence Framework, which I think has encouraged living knowledge. And we've invited Stephen to reflect on what this notion means to him.
Thanks very much, Paul, and it's a real pleasure to be part of this this panel discussion this morning. I think when I was reflecting on this to prepare for these comments, I went back to Kerry Facer and Brian Enright's report, and you know, it's a fantastic piece of work, and I really recommend everyone go and read it. But one of the things that struck me is that we need to expand this notion of living knowledge from beyond the community focus that report has, to include all the users and stakeholders and beneficiaries in research. And I think, you know, Helen made some comments about the healthcare system, for example, or local authorities, or you know, the diversity of our society needs to be brought into this process of learning and gathering knowledge through research. So for me, this concept extends to research really that's constructed through partnerships between academic researchers and wider society. And those actors in wider society will and probably should be thought of as researchers themselves. So I think we need to break down this kind of idea that research or being a researcher is somehow confined to certain job descriptions or types of employer. Living knowledge is about everyone being researchers. And I think it's also about using the insights that come from that collaborative research to bring about real societal change. And again, I think this, you know, echoes things that previous speakers have said, that the process of research, the findings of research and the outputs of the research are all great, but they are really there to deliver this broader societal change, in my view, if we're going to really talk about living knowledge. And the key thing for me in this really is working in that way, working in partnership, means that we have to acknowledge as part of that, that there are many, that everyone brings to those conversations their own expertise, and there are many different expertises that need to be brought together in the process of generating living knowledge. So it's not through academic research alone that societal change happens, but it's where we can triangulate the insights and expertises of a broad range of actors together to really start to tackle problems at their grassroots level. So the challenge for researchers in academic contexts is not just how do they take their research out in society and break down barriers and communicate it, but it's also about how do they work with others' expertise and do that in a way that's inclusive and respectful. You know, the key element to that for me really is, you know, we've heard about trust and respect from other speakers, but I'd also like to throw another word into the mix, which is humility. And I think everyone needs to go into these partnerships being humble about, but both confident in their own expertise and knowledge, but humble about its limitations and respectful of others' expertise. And that's the recipe really for creating living knowledge, in my view. As research funder, I guess there are really two ways that we can explore or encourage this type of working, through the funding that we provide and through the incentives that we can set. And I'm sure we'll touch on those aspects, funding and incentives, during the discussion to come. But I think there's a huge potential to really have a step change in the way in which we think about research partnerships and really do that in ways that you know, generate really good outcomes for society. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Stephen. So we've had our 4 speakers just sharing some perspectives on how they make sense of creating living knowledge and some of the things that are important to doing that. We're just going to give you a couple of minutes just to reflect yourself. What does creating living knowledge mean from your perspective? How are you making sense of it? If you want to pop any questions or reflections in chat, then please do so. We're just going to have just a moment to gather our breath, and then I'm going to be coming back to as a panel, and the panel, I'm going to kick you off by asking you about reflections on what the others you've heard from the others panelists, so just to give you a bit of time to reflect as well, and then we'll be joining together for our discussion. Great, thank you. So I think Jamie's very going to kindly bring our panelists all together so that we can have a conversation. And I've been just checking out questions in the chat. Great, brilliant. So thank you so much for your starting and framing comments. And I wanted to give you the opportunity to reflect or respond to anything you heard from what others said, and then we'll take some of the delegate questions. So maybe I could come to you first, Helen. Would you feel comfortable going first?
I'll give it a go. Thank you, Sophie. So the thing that works across all different levels probably are, what are the structures and behaviours and culture that either enables or inhibits all of this stuff to happen? Right? And that's it's interesting seeing a little bit in the chat about, you know, what do you care about thing, or what do Research England, and it's, you know, having a funder in the room is always going to sort of takes you in that direction a little bit, doesn't it? But there are some valid points about, you know, what are the right incentives, levers and structures that how can they flex and adapt there. And then sort of if you go down to an institutional level, what are the sort of enabling environment that allows an institution, whether it's a university or not, to feel comfortable, capable and respectfully, is the right word, work with people who have got very different motivations, vantage points, experiences, etc. And then the self is at how, at that point that Rusi says about trust, how do you build one-to-one trust with people actually on the ground in the field, where professional researchers aren't really often that welcome. I don't, in our experience, is why we work so much alongside community research and training people in that way. So I guess my opening gambit reflection would be that, yeah, enablers and inhibitors, let's explore that a little bit.
Ooh, and before we move on from enablers and inhibitors, moving on to, do you have an example of an enabler from your work that you think this really helps make this work?
I would say at an institutional level, despite the bad rep that many property developers have, have been working with Barking Riverside for a long time on co-creating a sort of a well-being and social value framework between the community and one of the biggest housing developments that's happening in Europe right now, I think. And the levels of trust, disconnect, and difference, and language even that gets spoken across those different groups, are so extreme and different. You know, the enabling space was actually a quite a sort of basic thing, which is that nobody walks into anybody else's door. So collaboration doesn't mean me walking into your door, and it doesn't mean it's creating an open forum where you can feel that you're going into a neutral space that might be held in some way, facilitated, but it doesn't feel like the power is being messed about with in the process. Yes.
Great, brilliant. Thanks, Helen. Rusi, I'll come to you.
Thanks, Sophie. So I think just touching on what Helen said, but also in particular responding to what Stephen said, and I just wanted to say, I think that the point about humility is very, very important indeed. And I think it's twofold. On the one hand, you have to acknowledge what your own limitations might be, given your main expertise. And you've also got to be quite confident about what you can bring to the table. And I think it's that very creative process that really leads to what we're trying to achieve here. And I think it's not just the case for living knowledge, it's also the case for truly interdisciplinary research. I think we often fail at that because we fail to see what the limitations of our own disciplines might be, and that stops us, or we may not have the same level of respect for another discipline. So I think if we can establish that, and of course that can be facilitated by, as Helen was saying, a very inclusive forum where all ideas are really valued, I think we can achieve a lot in this space. So I really think humility is important, and self-reflection and listening to others and dispelling this myth that you've got to have lots and lots of qualifications to be a researcher. We're all researchers. We all ask questions. We'll generate questions based on our lived experience. And in fact, I think the best research questions that we address are ones that have been developed by communities telling us what they need.
Ooh, and Rusi, before I come to you, Stephen, one of the responses to what you were saying was, I think, oh, that just sounds gloriously idealistic. And I think, oh, I'd love to see a future where we were all collaborators in creating living knowledge. But what do you think the role of you as a PVC, for at Brighton University is to create the conditions where that can happen?
That's a really good question. And I think at a very basic level, our events are open to members of the public, and we actively engage members of the public, and we try to entice them to come to our events by presenting our research in a way that's going to be very accessible to multiple communities. And I think that's what's at the heart of public engagement. And I think once you get people engaging with the university, they see the value that universities bring on many levels. Economic, of course, we talk a lot about the economic level, but also in terms of that knowledge exchange, how people can benefit in terms of acquiring particular skills, forming new partnerships that will benefit in positive change within their local environments, becoming empowered to become agents of change. So that's a really tangible example. It's about opening up spaces and ensuring that our research groups, which we call research and enterprise groups, I'd prefer research and knowledge exchange groups, really, to be honest with you. The acronym wouldn't work quite as well as research and enterprise groups. But our groups are also open to members of the public to engage with us, and I think having those spaces means that we increase the likelihood of that actually occurring.
Great, thank you, Rusi. And Stephen, over to you.
Yeah, so I think that the reflection really from my perspective is that we're all saying very similar things from our different perspectives. So there's a lot of kind of consistency in what we're saying. And I think just to add to the things that Helen and Rusi have just said, some of the we've talked about some of the features of good collaboration, and those features actually apply whether we're talking about collaboration between disciplines within an academic research context, or collaboration much more broadly. And just there's two things that I'd just add to that to what we've discussed already. And the first is that collaboration of any sort takes time, and people need time to process the differences and the different languages and expertises and ways of of thinking about things that come from different partners in a collaboration. And I think that's something that is regularly talked about, that the pace of research and the way in which research is structured in universities can sometimes be too fast to allow that time. And I think that's something we all can reflect on, about how we can make that space of time. And the second thing is maybe a bit controversial. I don't know, it'd be interesting to see whether this is controversial or not. But I think the other thing that we have to really acknowledge is that these types of partnerships will lead to conflict and disagreement. And actually, if there isn't that conflict and disagreement between the different partners, then actually, have we really got partnership? Are we really exploring everybody's perspective fully if we're not getting some conflict and disagreement? And what really matters is how we manage and use that conflict and disagreement. And I don't think, this is a kind of personal prejudice, but I'm not sure academic research is thinks about managing conflict in very productive ways. And sometimes that conflict can end up being destructive rather than constructive. So constructive conflict, I think, is needs to be at the heart of some of these partnerships.
So I wondered if I could just pick up on something that sort of really come into focus for me listening. And I thought, Helen, the way you framed living knowledge was just so refreshing. I think so often those of us who work within higher education, we always kind of start from where we are, and we start with our research and we think, how can we build connections? But what you did is you started from the world outside the university, and you talked about a flourishing society as one in which knowledge, learning, reflection, and thinking together animates how we make meaning, how we make good decisions, how we make change happen. And so what you're suggesting is, universities would be welcome guests to enter into this world in which knowledge circulates in such creative ways. And I think it would just be really interesting. I just wondered if you were to sort of help us understand what would make us welcome guests. How could we bring our particular specialist ways of making knowledge work and make them useful and valuable? What would you advise us?
I think you might be doing yourselves and the sector a disservice. I don't think they would be unwelcome. I think there's some highly skilled, deeply experienced people working in the universities and academia who absolutely understand what it means to work in a community setting. So with that caveat, I'll give you my thoughts, I guess. I think we touched on it right at the beginning, that and you know well that through the Institute for Community Studies, our entire research agenda is set by the priorities of our community. So 3,000 people across the country have told us what they think is important for us to research, and then we'll go off and research it. And I think that being slightly demand driven, whether at a national, regional or local level, is absolutely crucial. Anybody actually is well able to articulate the challenges and their own experiences, and often downgrade their ability to identify solutions is obviously often downgraded as well. So the sort of the question of who holds what kind of expertise, not to dismantle hierarchies of expertise in any different way. We all have different expertise, but there is definitely rich stuff sitting out there. I think one of the things that we have tried to do in a microscopic way, really, that I wish we could do at some kind of massive scale with lots of others, is to widen the pathways of exchange between communities and universities into the research profession itself. So we trained around, what we've done so far, not many, sort of 30 people through the Kickstart scheme, and trained them as community researchers, people who might have a GCSE, they might have an A-level, I think a couple of them have got an undergraduate degree, but people who have hadn't thought about research being their job. And we went through DWP and we recruited interviewers, and we've trained them in all the basic skills you need to interview, safeguarding, how to construct a survey, how to co-analysis, all at quite a basic level. But we've now got a cohort of people. There's not only like a fantastic talent pool of future work at the Young Foundation, but also all sorts of other opportunities. We know that they're being animated into thinking about research as a profession. People that I can guarantee would not be scooped up ordinarily by research application and recruitment rounds, but also have found a kind of confidence to talk to people, frankly, through their research, that really has sort of shown them lots of different other opportunities to get involved in. Research and the research discipline sort of appears implicitly in 1,000 different jobs, really. So I haven't quite answered your question, I guess, but it's sort of the accessibility of what an academic or a university institution does is nowhere near as complicated as it needs to be for people who are interested.
Great, thanks, Helen. I'm a little aware, I think that maybe Paul dropped out shortly, but I'm aware that we've got lots of delegate questions, and I feel I really need to hand over to our delegates to ask some of them. So this is a question for all the panel. It's been asked by Nat Day. I'm wondering if any of the panel can speak of their experiences or thoughts of how we navigate the inherent power imbalances that exist in making living knowledge, where in a lot of instances it's the universities who are then driving the agenda rather than the communities or the other stakeholders. So I don't know if anybody wants to take that question. You're all looking away from me. That's not a positive sign. Anybody? Look, Rusi, you made the mistake of smiling. Can I hand that to you? Oh, and you've put your hand up as well. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sophie. Yes, I don't really want to repeat what I already said, but I think that's partly what would address this, is that issue around trust. But I just wanted to also kind of return to a point that Stephen made also, which I didn't feel was controversial. I think it's actually very, very realistic indeed, and that is that there will be tensions. There will be, I like to call them healthy tensions. And I also like to just say that, you know, disagreement shouldn't lead to people falling out. And I think as long as we are very clear on the different ways in which we're approaching this process, we should be able to find a middle ground. I'll give you a tangible example. I've been involved in situations where I've been working with the community who might like to see a particular result or a particular outcome of the research process. And sometimes the outcome that's presented seems quite alien to them. They don't really identify with that. They are concerned about what the broader ramifications of that outcome might be. And then it's really about me explaining that research has to be data-driven, it has to be empirical on the one hand, but it also requires me to think about the fact that no research is ever completely apolitical. The questions we generate will be to some extent determined by priorities, by things that we have on our mind, things that we've been led to think about. So it's about meeting halfway and I think finding a healthy common ground between those two, what can seem to be two polar opposite positions. When we achieve that, we build trust and people start to feel that those power imbalances are slowly diminishing. It can sound idealistic, it's a difficult journey, but it's very well worth trying it if we're going to be serious about living knowledge.
Great, thanks, Rusi. I wonder, Helen, do you have any reflections on that? I feel like you might, in terms of that power imbalances and how we negotiate them.
Yes, I do, and probably a slightly different slant than the relationship, the power relationship between an institution and a community, or different levels of power. Because for those of us who, and there will be many in the room, I'm sure, who do work in communities, they're certainly not conflict-free zones, and there's certainly power. It's a very different kind of power, but it gets flung around in some slightly different ways. So you're not in uncontested, beautiful, fluffy community space. We all know that, and there's definitely, you know, we have to, because we do community development work as well, of a certain kind. You know, we are often in the business of being conflict resolution arbiters. You know, the way in which, you know, a Bengali community, someone who wants to run a Zumba class, somebody who wants to use a community centre as a church, and someone who wants to use it as a kind of artisanal bread making thing on a Saturday, bringing people's groups together to work out how you resolve, how you create inclusive space for different communities to come together in a physical space, is a very small example. You know, that's like 3 days and the rest of trying to make that something like that work. So it requires a sensitivity that's more nuanced than assumed power between an institution and a community, I think, which of course does exist, but it's not a complete.
Great, thank you, Helen. And Stephen, do you wish to reflect on that, or do you want us to move on?
No, I would like to reflect on that. You know, I think it's a good question, because I think the power imbalances are really important in you know, in all of these kind of conversations, and they work in different ways. You know, where you know, researchers are working with partners in business, for example, the power balance can be, you know, the university can be the least powerful actor in that partnership. So it can work all ways. But I think for me, the thoughts I would have on this is first that just talking about the fact that there are power imbalances and acknowledging that is really helpful, you know, in forming a partnership. And then the other observation I would have is that, you know, one of the natures of power imbalances is actually much easier for those who have power to give it away than it is for those who don't have power to claim it. I'm not saying it's impossible for it to work that way around, but I think the onus is on the partners who have power or are felt to have power to do things to give that power away. And so in the context of a research, of a university and a researcher, that might mean, you know, handing over some of the control of the design of the research program, the direction it takes to the partners, and accepting that you have to work in that way and hand out some of that power, or you know, if it's financial resources that are the issue, giving people who don't have access to those financial resources some of the control or all of the control over the resources that you are bringing to the party. So I think the onus is on the people in the partnership with the power to think about how they can give that power away.
Great, thanks, Stephen. And I wonder whether we could turn to some of the more practical kind of outworkings of what this looks like. And there have been a lot of messages in the chat and in the Q&A, and I have to confess that I am struggling a bit to keep up with what the panel is saying. So forgive me if I'm missing your questions, but there's a very specific question for you, Stephen, about the balancing of research excellence with the idea that all of us are researchers and creating living knowledge. So I'm going to come to you for that. Helen, a very practical question. Well, how do you compensate people who participate within these spaces? So, you know, how are they compensated for their time and the energy, enthusiasm? And you've got rather a lucky one, Rusi. You've been given a magic wand. If you had a magic wand, what one thing would you do to make it easier for staff and students to engage in this type of work? So I'm going to take those questions in that order, if that's all right. Stephen, over to you.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think there are two ways of framing it, really. One is to say, you know, what do we add to the mix of incentives beyond excellence to incentivize the sort of work that we're talking about here, or the second framing, which I have to say is the one I prefer, is how can we rethink what we mean by excellence to actually be more inclusive and to encompass the activities that we're talking about here. And the reason I like that framing better is that I really don't like the idea that that something that works with partners and co-creates knowledge and brings about real change is in some way not excellent, because clearly that is what we're aiming, what we should be aiming for. We should be aiming to use our knowledge and expertise to bring about change. So in my view, that the way to tackle this is to broaden our concept of what excellent research is, to include those concepts, and that's the sort of approach that we've been trying to take in the REF by including societal impact as part of the measure. And I still get annoyed when people talk about the excellence part of the REF and the impact part of the REF. That impact is inherent to what we're saying is excellent research. So and I think there's more we can do in that space. We can think about how we evaluate research proposals with a broader view of excellence, and that's certainly something that in UKRI we're very much grappling that agenda and thinking about how we can broaden the way in which we describe research excellence to encompass a wider range of people and outcomes than it maybe currently is framed as.
Great, thanks, Stephen. And now over to you, Helen, to think about how we compensate people who participate.
Yes. Okay, so it falls into two categories, I would say, sort of extrinsic and intrinsic compensation. So I'm not sure if those are the right words, but some are hard and some are less hard. So we're slightly unique, I think, maybe in that the community researchers that we work with in the field, we employ them on the same employment contracts that I would have. And that means so they get the benefits that we have, even if they're with us with a fairly short amount of time when they get paid the national living wage, which is quite unusual. Normally they're compensated with vouchers or not at all. What we're trying to do or experiment with is building a different kind of talent pool in the places where we're operating really deeply. Would be the sort of, an instrumental version. Actually, what we're doing is giving people qualifications. So through that training and that employment opportunity, they also get a chance to become accredited with a level 2 peer research. So there's some kind of tangible certification at the end of it. And the people who they in turn then go and interviewed for this sort of half an hour or hour of that other person's time usually get compensated with vouchers of different kinds. So there's like a hard thing, but actually, and that's important, but also we know that as well about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, and that intrinsic motivation plays a part too, and if not more in some places. So if we're doing really demand-driven, needs-led, ambitious-led work that's been identified by the people who are conducting the research, there is intrinsic motivation and compensation for them in seeing and understanding and being given the space to explore something that perhaps hasn't been recognised, respected, or even thought about by anyone else. So there's a real sort of strong sense of value creation of this is a problem that I feel and you feel it too, and there's something in there. And in turn then, if when we're doing that research, when we go back to the community that's been working with, whether that's of interest or usually the case, we want the people who are involved in that research to see their research in it. So when we're reflecting back outputs or in whatever form that is, they see themselves and the language they've talked about, their words being amplified to others. And then the last bit is like, so what? So you made a nice bit of research and you did a little bit of a story and then you did a bit of a film, and then so what? There's being able to see that somebody else is interested in that. So whether it's a local council or whoever they're trying to influence, having a point, like an end point for that research is really important. It might not be a shared consensus. There might be lots of different ambitions that emerge along the way, but there being some goal to actually, we want this research to change something, whether we change it or we want someone else to change it. Those sorts of things, when you stack them all together, can mean quite a generative experience for some people.
Great, thanks Helen, that's really helpful. And Rusi, you have been granted a magic wand, so what are you going to do? What one thing are you going to do to make it easier for staff and students to participate in this kind of work?
Well, there are many occasions where I would greatly value a magic wand, but actually in this context, I don't think one's required. So I'll save the wand for other scenarios. I just sort of outlined some of the things we've been doing to really engage staff and students around this agenda. I think the first thing is that all of the main academic portfolios have to be aligned, and we've gone to great lengths to try and bridge our research and our teaching around some key themes, which we're calling the global challenges. And they're essentially based on the Sustainable Development Goals. And they are the areas where we feel we need to be engaging at a global level, but also at a local level, a community level as well. So it's embedded within our curriculum, it's embedded within our research knowledge exchange strategy. And I think that's absolutely key. Now, the second thing is we need to really ensure that we are valuing this type of activity and we demonstrate to colleagues that it is valued. So I was really delighted to see the participatory research funding allocation by Research England, which of course ties into this type of activity, and it demonstrates that this is something that's being valued. This is something that we want to support. We want to support areas of excellence, and I emphasize excellence because it's part of excellence. We want to support this type of impact activity as well, and we will support you along that journey to make this activity grow, albeit in the particular areas that we've collectively agreed should be our priority areas. So that's really important. And I think the final and actually the most important point is identifying areas of great practice, areas where there's been a lot of success, and brandishing it and influencing other areas of the university. There are some disciplines where this type of work comes very naturally because it's been going on for a long time. There are other areas where a contribution can be made, but colleagues maybe think, well, it's not the sort of stuff that we do in our discipline. And that's why I think it ties in with interdisciplinarity. The best living knowledge, in my opinion, is that which is bringing together disciplines. So if we can get colleagues working together from different areas, we build capacity, I think, and so that's what I would say is really possible if we have a coordinated approach.
Yeah, that's really lovely, Rusi, and Laura, for one, is appreciating the fact that you raised that participatory research funding. And Stephen, I just wondered whether Rusi has not picked up the magic wand. I wondered if I might pass it to you. and see whether you would like that magic wand. I think you've been really patient in really nudging and encouraging and supporting the sector to embrace engagement and impact, etc. But if you could seize that magic wand and speed up the pace of change, are there things that you think could really help?
Yeah, and this is a magic wand job because it what I'm about to suggest hits the kind of pragmatic, practical reality of how you run things. But I think when you look at the ref at the moment, we have a balance between traditional academic outputs and impact that's at the kind of 60 to 25%. So that's the sort of ratio between those things. And I think I would love to have a research excellence evaluation process that was much more valued and weighted towards those societal outcomes. And the reason I say that you do need the magic wand for that is because that then comes against these barriers about how do you do that measurement and how do you do that assessment and how robust is it and all of those kind of practical considerations. But yes, my magic wand would be to have a research excellence framework that was almost exclusively based on outcomes and societal benefit, and had much less focus on academic research outputs, because I believe the academic research outputs will come if your focus is on that delivering societal change. But yes, whether that's possible to implement is another matter.
Thank you. And in a minute, we're going to invite each of our panelists to help us all think about, so what can each of us do to progress this agenda and to make living knowledge more of a reality. So we'll come to that in a second. But Helen, I thought it was unfair not to offer you the magic wand as well, just in case you had something up your sleeve.
You've caught me on the hop. No one's ever done that before. A magic wand, I think, would be. It might seem like a random example, but it links to sort of what Stephen's talking about around the idea of research being broadened and having a very strong kind of societal outcome. Is that there's so much place-based work happening at the moment, place-based thinking and systems thinking and all this sort of things everywhere, wherever you go. And whenever we're talking, or I'm talking to people about this, they often see themselves as the leader of the place. And there is definitely, come right back to the beginning of sort of being a little bit humble, and then to Stephen's point again about giving up a little bit of power. Like, none of this stuff works if we bring the kind of accoutrements of our culture, learned and embedded practice, structures, hierarchies, accountability, governance, all of that hard wiring that we think we can't change because often we're not allowed to change. Arguably, there's a very ripe seam of innovative practice that could happen in experimenting with different structures. But for people to sort of come to a table for collaboration as themselves, we're showing their soft organizational underbelly a little bit more. It comes back to sort of being a bit more human and less institutional about our outlook, really.
And that so builds on so much of the work at the moment focused on research cultures, on our behaviors with each other as researchers and professionals working in universities, let alone our relationships outside. So that is, it feels that so many different aspects of the challenge are coalescing at the moment. So it's really exciting. But I think, Sophie, we really want to sort of move into the idea of really what can we do about this, and what are actions that we can each take to push this work forward, because we all believe it matters. And I think we had a question for each of our panel again, and we'd also really invite people in chat to share their thoughts as well. But the question that we wanted to come to was, what would you recommend to others who are trying to influence change as concrete actions that they could take that would help us collectively move this work forward? And I don't know, Stephen, whether it would be fair for me to come back to you, maybe first of all, and then to Rusi and then to Helen, but what could we do individually in our teams to take this work forward?
Yeah, so I think, I think this question is about what others would do. And I think, I've been quite inspired by what Rusi has said this morning. And I think, getting that sort of thinking across more universities would be really, really productive. So, thinking about research from the partnership, starting from the partnership endpoint and thinking about interdisciplinarity and how those collaborations work, and having that as the key driver of research strategy in our universities. I think that would go a long way to creating the conditions for this type of living knowledge to thrive.
Thank you. Rusi, how about for you?
Well, Paul, this question comes at a really great moment for our institution, because we're just about to actually develop our next strategic plan for research and knowledge exchange. And what we're doing is we're engaging with colleagues from across the entire university at all levels, and we're asking them what living knowledge means to them and what they aspire to actually achieve. And I think if that can be woven into a research and knowledge exchange strategy, and I think at any point a strategy can be created specifically around this very important agenda, I think it then increases the likelihood of engagement and it embeds it within the university. I think if we can also align this type of activity with our university values, and every university of course has a set of values, it then acquires a unique, distinctive flavor. And it means we're all doing this, but we're doing it in a way that's sort of enabling us to achieve our overall institutional strategy. So I think we can actually use this as a vehicle, a very effective vehicle, for achieving what we want to do as universities, that are for the public good.
Great, thank you. And Helen?
Yeah, there's so much to think about there. Thank you, Vicky. I guess what I might suggest is that the really important thing from our vantage point when we're doing this work is that it's of the highest possible quality work with the clearest point that we work, clear goal of what we ideally would like to get to. And I think there's a general challenge in that living knowledge doesn't sit still. It shouldn't sit still. And so, you're in a sort of slightly more fluid environment, but some of the controls are slightly more, or sort of ways in which you're supposed to work in an academic institution are not quite aligned to that. So I think part of what I would love to see more of, which what we're trying to do, as I say, in a very teeny tiny way, is to bridge research into innovation and properly build the sort of way in which those research outputs, that research process where the impact is created in the room, actually does translate by very purposefully into change. And my reflections on perhaps the worst of what we do is where we think that the engagement stops when we publish our report and somebody else from a different university says it's a great thing. So for me, that just isn't any kind of impact at all, or any kind of real, it's great to have the quality assurance, but it doesn't really make the change. So I would much rather see us sort of the excellence and the sort of the way in which we work moving forward, just value that those human relationships that Kate was talking about, that's so important, that they translate into action with a broader set of actors, and that the relationships that create as a result of that are more deeply valued. And we try, as I say, my vantage point, we're trying to do that a little bit, but I don't know how commonly held a view that would be, or desire that.
Great, thanks, Helen. And I want to, there are several delegate questions, and I invite our panelists at the end, we maybe could write answers to some of the questions we're not covering, but one of the ones really struck a chord with me, and it was aimed at you, Rusi, but I think we all might have reflections on this. And so we've all talked about trust, that and the long-term nature of building trust with different partners, but the question basically says, well, how do you balance that, the need to establish those trusted relationships, with the criticism we get or fear for always working with the same partners? And I remember this coming up really strongly in the UK Community Partner Network, that sense that a community organisation says, well, we want to carry on this relationship now we've got it, because it's actually leading benefit to us all. And then other communities, well, we don't have the resource to engage with them then, because clearly we're putting our resources here and we don't have unlimited resources. So there's a real challenge to that balance. So I'm going to come to you first, Rusi, because the Joanna Sawkins, who asked the question, asked it specifically of you. But Helen and Stephen, I think you'd have really interesting reflections to add to that too. So Rusi, over to you.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you very much also for the question. I think it's a really brilliant question. Unfortunately, I don't have a very good response to the question because it's about, there is always a risk. I think when you identify areas where you want to have engagement activity of this kind, there is a risk that there will be a few people who are very supportive, who can function and operate as gatekeepers. And in a way, you don't really have very much first-hand contact with members of the community because it's those gatekeepers who are facilitating it. But I do think that if we really want to succeed, we've got to try and move beyond that. And I think try to work with those gatekeepers to have direct access to communities, to empower other people to participate in the way in which trusted people with whom we already enjoy a relationship are engaging with us. So I think it's about capacity building within the communities with which we wish to work. There is also a real risk that our engagement with communities becomes tokenistic, where there are just a few people. Oh, it's safe to speak to these people because they engage with us and they give us the right type of response. So we're not going to try to engage with others. And I would really like to avoid that because it can be very counterproductive. It would damage the trust that's so essential for bringing to fruition our plans around living knowledge. So it's not really a response, but it's certainly something I shall reflect upon, how we engage more widely.
Great, thank you, Rusi. And Helen or Stephen, would either of you like to respond to that? Helen, you put your mic on.
Sorry, yes. So I agree with Rusi entirely. And one of the things that you will know, obviously, all of us probably, is that communities hate parachutists, don't like it. And why should they, right? So if you go in and go, oh, I'll just work with you for a couple of years and we'll do some interesting things and then we'll pop off, thank you. You know, that's really sort of, that happens all the time, particularly in international development, but it also happens in this country too. And so, you know, that sustained engagement with a particular community, which will often include a number of different maybe anchor or community organisations, is really important. And you do get depth and deepening of quality of trust and impact by working continually with people beyond. And we're often found sort of, you know, bleeding outside our projects because we want to work with people for more amounts of time. The danger zone is when that all becomes very comfortable and exclusive, because I said before, you know, communities are not homogenous places. And so having the boundaries and the porousness to sort of to recognise and be self-aware of where you might be coming too comfortable and slightly less challenging of each other, and sort of allowing more people and enabling more people to come in, I think is just a practice of self-awareness in the field.
Great, thanks, Helen. And Stephen.
Yeah, so I suppose my reflection is a very good question, and I agree there are no straightforward answers to it. But I guess my reflection would be that one of the things that universities need to do in this space is they do need to be strategic. That is to say, they need to decide where their strengths are and where their focus is, and work on that for the long term. So I suppose I'm coming down on the, you know, in this balance between long term and short term, very much in the kind of long term end of the spectrum. And I don't think that, you know, some universities are very good at being strategic about their work and their research and their partnerships, and others less so. And I think, you know, some learning that can come there. I also think that, you know, an important part of this is about positioning yourself in a place-based context, positioning yourself in a network of organizations in your locality. So you don't necessarily need to be working closely with everyone, but if there is a network, you have your routes to find partners. And so the trust, you know, the trust question can become trust by proxy. So if, you know, if you've worked with partner A and partner A has worked with partner B, and you can go along with the recommendation, then maybe you can go in and have a high level of trust, you know, from the outset, without having put in all that work. You've put in the work to develop one relationship, but it pays into another partnership in the future. So that, I think that sort of network thinking in a local context is maybe quite important too.
And that theme came up, Stephen, yesterday in the conversation around sort of civic universities and how people are using that framing to really help them articulate their ambitions in this space. But I think also conversations have been, it's so different in different places. What democratic structures exist locally and what decision-making structures and what partnerships and networks exist outside the university. Going back to Helen's point about, there are vibrant knowledge ecosystems around us, but in different parts of the UK, that's very, very different. And so what universities can do will be very different depending on what's already in place almost. So I think better understanding that would really help us all probably. So Sophie, we probably need to move to wrapping up.
Yeah, we're just going to wrap up the session, but I'm just going to ask each of you for one final reflection. So you've got very short time to say that, but one final reflection. And I just want to pose two little thoughts for your final reflection. One is about a question around the skills needed to work across difference and hold the spaces where that conflict can happen, Stephen, in productive and useful ways. And the other was a plea to say, well, how's this relevant to disciplines that aren't obviously engaging immediately with societal challenges, but are still very relevant? And that's a question about, for a theoretical physicist, for example, as I once was, or a mathematician. So either of those strands you can pick up on in your final comment. And I'm going to go in the order in which you spoke, if that's all right with everybody, which unfortunately for you, Rusi, means that you are going to go first. So you haven't got any time to reflect.
I have to just speak my mind and speak very spontaneously. No, but I think actually I passionately believe that every discipline has a role to play here. And it also depends on what it is we want to achieve. For me, imparting knowledge and getting people to think critically about any issue is a massive societal achievement. And so I think that's certainly something everyone can be doing. I wouldn't dare to try to hazard a guess as to how a physicist would do this, because I don't know anything about physics, but I think there is a role that every discipline can play, and I really honestly do believe that. And as I said earlier, I think if disciplines that are very accustomed to this sort of activity could share their knowledge with other members of the academic community, it empowers, it builds capacity, and I'd like to encourage that, and create fora in which that sort of knowledge exchange activity can occur.
Thanks, Rusi. Helen.
How on earth do you chop that? What he said is what I would say in the answer to that. That's excellent. Your second point. I was thinking the same about the sort of physicist point. I think if you've got a lot of quantum physicists with a lot of living knowledge researchers, that might be quite an interesting combination. Have an epistemological debate about the nature of objectivity or something like that. There's something in there about what is really probably a subject for a different workshop. But it's a trite point. You talked about the skills needed for this kind of work. So often we are incapable, and it's been touched on a little bit, of being honest and open about the impact that we've had, about the skills and limitations that we have, about recognizing that somebody else might be better at doing something, but doesn't mean to say that we're less of an organization because of that. So it's about sort of in quite a profound sense, really, just trying to dissolve the egos of our institutions a little bit. And I think if we all did a little bit of that, and we're a little bit kinder to each other in terms of the vantage points that we're all operating in. All of us have restrictions and restraints, and very often that becomes a critical lens that people apply to that sort of thing. So if you're talking about community, communitarianism, collaboration, you have to embody the spirit of that in the practice of our own work as much as sort of when we're doing things with other people.
Oh, I love it. And I love just that concept of dissolving egos. I think that sounds glorious. I shall be working on that. And Stephen, over to you.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Helen and Rusi have said. I'll go back to the kind of the full range of disciplines, and I think there is enormous value in people being inspired and having their curiosity piqued and just learning more about the world and how it works. And so we shouldn't downplay that as a societal impact at all. And I think that, the way in which this plays into living knowledge, I think is, how many theoretical physicists, really understand the things that really fascinate people from outside of their discipline, that they want to know about how the world within the universe works, and understanding some of those questions, some of which we might already know the answers to, but some of them might inspire people to think about their research in different ways, and we won't know that unless those conversations and interactions are happening. So yeah, I think this can apply in all disciplinary contexts.
Brilliant.
Wonderful.
Oh, what brilliant answers. And so can I thank the panel for your reflections and your input. It's been really stimulating talking with you.